Some people wonder, do I have such great talent I belong in Hollywood? For instance, 3 years ago I was at a coffee shop and the coffee server struck me a certain way, and I'd said, "Has anyone ever told you you'd do great in Hollywood?" And she said, "Yeah, in fact, several people have told me that." And in general, a lot of people, we wonder, am I a people person or more of an office type person, data person, behind the scenes person? If I'm a really big people person, maybe I belong in Hollywood on the silver screen even. Maybe I'm the next up and coming who and no. But we have doubts, and plenty of people go and find out that they don't make the grade. And then they have to struggle, office jobs, or pack it up and come back to podunk, tail between their legs. Others then say, "I told you so. You were too full of your britches." Now, I think there are two general approaches. Usually, the don't do something dumb approach, have prudence. Don't go out on a limb, and thus don't chase your dreams that might be in part based upon who you think you are if you think you have special talents in the people department. In other words, more and more we hear it said, don't think you're the exception to the rule of having created a better mousetrap and that you can just build a field of dreams and that they will come because you're something superlative compared to the average person. But I would say it's rather like childhood. A child who tests their parents to see just how far they can get away with something might be getting feedback they wouldn't get otherwise. The same with laws, for instance. Are all laws enforced or only some? If we were to pay equal heed to all warnings on signs, for instance, saying you could spend such and such numbers of years in prison for a trivial offense, where would we be unless we've tested those laws to see whether they are in fact real or they're just paper tiger laws meant to saber rattle us? Same then with parents, especially heavy-handed parents, doing the best they can, of course. What are the true limits? And of course then, what are our true limits? How would we know unless we test out our hypotheses or what we are generally told? Namely, you could never make it in terms of something superlative rather than what Dr. David Schwartz calls mediocre or average. So isn't it better then to try a lot of things and fail at some of them and find our limits and the limits in life imposed upon us from others than to settle for the breadcrumbs, as I call it, of life? Take what we're handed, basically, and be told, well, that's the best we all can do. For I believe many things in life can only be discovered by getting feedback, not just from books. In fact, books may play only a minor role, I believe. And teaching in brick and mortar institutions also. We get what is most important, I believe, by feedback from our environment. We call this feedback mistake-making all too often if it doesn't turn out exactly like we had hoped, but it is still a classroom. In fact, some of the biggest lessons, I think, in this classroom of life, including what we call failures all too often, I think, are matters that you can't learn from a brick and mortar institution or a typically published book, because it is material you have to learn that is not going to be on the record, so to speak. That's some of the hardest key information then to learn. Material that people would not want to stick their neck on and publish or teach widestream. And so it's stuff that you call learning on the underground, including, in certain countries, censored books, which can fly off the shelves in certain countries, or, again, material you get from the School of Hard Knocks, including chasing those so-called dreams that so many of us are told are foolish to pursue. What if these are the only way of learning key lessons? Because many of them, whether we win or fail as we define it, our original goal, the silver lining goals pay later down the line in what you learn that is off the record knowledge, I would call it. Not going to be found in a book coming out from a major publisher especially, or even most times an independent publisher, unless it's coming from overseas. Or in rare instances, it's coming from somebody in your country who happens to have a big compound with a lot of security guards, so to speak, or millions of followers, and lots of money in general for protection, including the protection of lawyers that can be bought for protection in court. So all of that out of the way then, as to why I think it's good to pursue what we call dreams, because that's the only way of getting key feedback, key knowledge that otherwise is not purchasable, or most people would not feel comfortable at all putting out, so to speak. What are some errors then that can give a lot of people trouble in, quote, going to Hollywood or pursuing that big people-based goal, I think? How can we misinterpret our level of people skills, if you want to put it that way? For we may have been on a cheerleading team or a football team, or been very popular in high school or college, and be told we're very much a people person, but we have reservations. And how do we know? Here are some criteria I think I've come up with. This is through my School of Hard Knocks, my time in the military, where I went in to be a physician, hoping, and so on. First, if we're told or we think we're a people person, I think there are two types of people persons. Those who are uplifting in the long term, not the short term. In other words, they're emotionally uplifting, not manipulative, shall we say. For take even a smile. We're probably not going to be considered a people person if we never smile, unless you're in certain avenues. For instance, if you're a Marine, it's kind of accepted. It's powerful maybe in some circumstances not to smile, including on a battlefield. Or if you're in prison, you probably find it better not to smile in many cases. You're deemed weak otherwise. Yes, too much smiling on some people's faces can be interpreted, sometimes accurately, as a form of naivety. And yet, to never smile in most circles is interpreted as a sense of bullying or hostility, although I don't like that former word I just used. So the opposite then, if we are given to being able to smile constantly, is that necessarily being a people person, or is it a great skill in hiding certain issues in our lives like anger or fear? In other words, if we have a painted-on clown smile, is that the best way of being a people person? Can we misinterpret this as a great skill above and beyond, say, this Marine look, if you will, in all avenues of life, not just on a battlefield or only with men. For to smile constantly may deem us being a people person in certain circles, and in other circles being a vixen or cunning, or somebody who will slip a knife in your back when you're not looking. A great consummate con man, so to speak. A great used car salesman. So are all great used car salesmen then great people who ought to be in Hollywood or chasing other people-oriented career fields to the max? Good question. For you consider the so-called nerd who is your so-called skinny, pimple-faced ectomorph, and yet writes some of the most profound information, often in science fiction, addressing moral issues, people issues in general, better than anyone else sometimes. This kind of idea, too, in the movie Sideways, fascinating movie. Now, a sincere smile, though, as I call it, or maybe an optimal smile, is one that has variability to it, I think. It's not painted on maximally nor minimally. In other words, it's not on all the time in a manipulative fashion, or it's not off all the time in terms of the marine look, as I would call it, just for lack of a better word right now. Second, a pair of issues, perhaps. We may think we are a great people person, but then, of course, have reservations in the back of our mind because we have been brought up to be yes men, so to speak. There are more derogatory terms, of course, like being willing to kiss somebody's you-know-what to get what you want. Others in foreign countries, perhaps, maybe Japan, calling it being very agreeable. And there even being a scale then to measure a person on the degree of being agreeable. In other words, in my estimate, telling people what they want to hear. Or you might say in certain circles too, doing what it takes to fit in or conform. And maybe totally. And when not legally necessary. For instance, it is said that, quote, when dealing with a, quote, narcissist, or as I would put it, somebody who lacks empathy and seeks to have an appearance that doesn't match who they really are by some external means. A video fascinatingly has talked of these individuals, the so-called narcissists, wanting narcissistic supplies. In other words, being told in my book, yes, you're fantastic, you're great, you're number one. You might say, in a sense, too, kissing their you-know-what, or amusingly or not, as one video at least has put it, learning how to fluff a narcissist, how to tell them what will suit what they want to hear, crave to hear. Namely, a denial that they're, in many respects, average at least, if not below average, I would say. Of course, there are other avenues, too, to try and be pleasing. Rather than telling something intellectually, one may be tried to be pleasing sexually. For instance, Michael J. Fox was in a movie way back. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but he basically went from mailroom to the top in a company by sleeping his way to the top. I think the movie was called The Secret of My Success. Humorous and truth-telling to an extent. Of course, that doesn't have to be taken literally sleeping one's way. It can be suggestive through one's smile, the coyness aspect, and the clothing being very suggestive, if you know what I mean. But in other words, a bartering approach, so to speak, depending on one's gender, I might add, obviously. So you might say, telling someone what they want to hear about a denial they have or some weak aspect that another person would rather not see. Or secondly, not just telling somebody, but doing something for somebody in the sexual department or suggesting it might happen. You might call them, in a sense, a tease at a minimum. Of course, it helps in the people department to have, I believe, a body type that is generally more conducive to lower levels of anxiety, or fear, if you will. And by that I mean a body that is not frail. Sad to say, or whatever, the ectomorph, a frailer body in many respects, just like a female's body. One man says 50% less in body mass, or maybe it was body strength, or both, compared to a male. Well, the ectomorphic male, the same thing, and in turn interpreted, in my view, as somebody more prone to anxiety and compensating through different methods, not given in the same manner to the mesomorph, shall we say, the football player type. In other words, one Hollywood scout put it this way, who I met 3 years ago. He believes ectomorphs can't make it in Hollywood, no matter what other talents. I would say now, interpreting that, probably because the ectomorph is deemed a typical nerd or bean counter or someone in that avenue because of their frailty, making them much more likely to believe whatever told and not be able to handle confrontation in general, and having in general high levels of anxiety, which do not make you much of a people person. And yet that can be transcended, but only on rare occasion perhaps. So the people-type persons generally finding their way gravitating to the belief they are people by means of a body type less prone to high levels of anxiety. But then, of course, the opposite can be true, that the person of the football player, more robust physical nature may lack brain power that comes in part through application in lots of study, having been shunned, ironically, from the social scene, especially in high school. So a person may have people skills in one area, low levels of anxiety, say, by body type, and yet in the other area be missing great mental acumen. And without great mental acumen, how can you understand people greatly, how they tick, so to speak? Like Christopher Plummer kept saying he was striving to do in that most second popular series ever in America, miniseries, The Thornbirds. If you don't have great brain power, how can you understand people maximally? And without that, in turn, be a fabulous people person. For you may be constitutionally less prone to anxiety and be a more adept people person in that realm, but if you lack the brain power to go further than that and understand people, that can be a mixed bag, I believe. Another reason why some people can find themselves in Hollywood and come up short. They may be thus a flash in the pan also if they get started great. They will make big mistakes perhaps down the line because they're lacking in the thinking department, while great in the smile department sometimes, or the low anxiety department also. Low anxiety doesn't mean, for instance, then we know just what words to say and where, how to be most respectful, and how to plan things out in the long term using brain power, as per Napoleon Hill's book, How to Think and Grow Rich. Or you might say, how to think and make it best in Hollywood in the long term, not just maybe short term. I might add, there are examples galore of talk show hosts who made it for years or decades, but through lack of brain power maybe, and the ensuing respect level high enough, and treatment of others high enough, they were what you might call 2-decade-long flashes in the pan, I would say. And it comes to haunt them then in their 60s, all too often. We then see their shows go belly up, and these individuals in lawsuit after lawsuit, in a divorce court, custody battles, and more. They may end up destitute, in fact, financially. Which then leads me on to another key point. How many of us think we may be key, high-level people, but lack respect for others, often because we lack the vocabulary to be respectful with, even if we had high levels of empathy? For I don't necessarily believe at all that these co-locate, that they're given out, so to speak, by the universe or what have you, fate, in equal proportion. One can have a loving grandmother, for instance, but the loving grandmother may not teach you highly respectful words and a ton of them. She may not even teach you what words not to use. Next, how much courage does the individual have, even if they are, quote, seemingly people, for the reasons I've outlined above, in certain departments? For, as I've heard it said and seen in my own life, anybody can be happy enough when everything's going right. You may even call them the equivalent of fair weather friends. But the rubber meets the road, I think, or what is the phrase? You see the separation between the boys and the men when things get tough. Who can hang in there then, and who cannot seek to blame shift or get bitter? Who cannot quit when the going gets tough too, in general? Yes, I've seen that over and over in motivational speeches. Don't quit. David Goggins talking this, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and many others. Napoleon Hill, too, in his book, How to Own Your Own Mind. Now, where that kind of courage comes from, of course, is something everybody would like to know. I have some of my own ideas, but it varies from person to person, how we might come across this. All I can say is I believe it's basically a gift you can't conjure up out of thin air without the necessary components already put into your life, or that you can somehow get. And do you even have the courage to get those further components? For instance, if the School of Hard Knocks by going to prison were the best way of getting courage training, who wants to sign up for that? And I would further say, if I didn't already completely, that it's easy to misinterpret one's respect level, or in general, to see that one has not much respect. Call it tactlessness, if you will, or sticking your foot in your mouth all the time. Or at a very minimum, not knowing what words are going to get you in a lot of hot water. Maybe just 3, 4, 5 of these. This is interestingly talked of in a number of books, including The 4 Agreements, and interestingly even in cognitive behavioral therapy, such as a kingpin book that came out around 1980 by Dr. David D. Burns, Feeling Good, The New Mood Therapy. Well, in my book, The New Happiness Therapy, and his kingpin idea is that your thoughts govern your feelings, and I would say in general your thoughts govern your happiness level, But even moreover, your thoughts are comprised of your words, and your words had better have a couple key components to them, namely respect. This word, sadly though, or not, never once appeared in the book. My quick and dirty interpretation of what respect is, by the way, is somehow knowing and then communicating to others that you know they did the best they can under all circumstances. And disrespect being to somehow convey, you could have done better, and so I don't like you, and I think you're a piece of garbage. But then that's expecting an acorn to be a full oak tree, or that's expecting also an average person to be a Lincoln or a Gandhi or some other person, without the necessary resources and other constraints taken away. Thus, to understand somebody is to respect them, particularly to understand their shortcomings and why those are there and what constraints prevent them from growing. To not see that and communicate otherwise than to people outsized, impossible expectations can be very disrespectful, we interpret it. Or as I love it was said once in this show, a 5-part series by Diane Sawyer around 2010, ABC News, I think, put it on. Children of the Mountains. Appalachians were talked of derogatorily sometimes as having too much trash in their front yards, including broken down old washing machines or older broken down cars. But a social worker then commented, there's a lack of resources, the lack of availability of such resources, namely to take and do away with this trash, namely pick it up and economically. Isn't that then the story of all of us? The, quote, trash in our lives that doesn't change because we can't pick it up, because we can't find the means to do so. Namely, in terms of personality, change things, change this so-called trash in our own lives. To recognize why someone else's emotional or attitudinal equivalent of a broken down washing machine in the front yard of their life can't be changed is a marked plus feather in the cap that we call respect, I believe. It's understanding. It's understanding, namely, the different types of broken down washing machines in people's lives, not just our own. I would say then, too, some think they're Hollywood material because they're such a hard worker. And they've been told you're a hard worker and that hard work can accomplish anything. But I think hard work cannot accomplish easily the overcoming of a childhood that was lacking in empathy, or if you were taught something very incorrect about the fundamentals of life. Call them your core premises, if you will, which can be very difficult to overcome, I think, given that some of these core premises are part of your culture and taught widely, or there can be materials bought easily to reinforce such. And certain core principles, maybe not very popular. Yes, in general then, we can fail to see the certain denials in our lives, certain blind spots, if you will, certain kahunas, certain lacunas, but we sense something may be there. Finally, what about thinking we are great people and would make it great in a people career, including Hollywood, but we are holding it together with some kind of chemical means? There have been many singers, for instance, Johnny Cash, for instance, who held it together for a while with, quote, uppers and downers, but that could only go on so long. Many others, too, held it together for a while with alcohol. Who was it, for instance, that recently came out with a big, monumental memoir? A person who was an actor in the series Friends. Was his name Matthew Perry? He struggled mightily and was in rehab many, many times for alcohol. And yet that helped him in the short term or middle term hold his act together, literally. This also goes for the greats even in comedian land. George Carlin, for instance, has struggled with drugs, I don't know, maybe alcohol, his whole life. Another individual comes to mind. Richard Pryor, fabulous comedian also. Struggled very much with drugs his whole life also. In the music department, also Keith Richards used to purchase pharmaceutical-grade heroin for many, many years. This detailed in a biography he came out with a few years ago. Did I mention Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones? Drug use endemic. Very, very commonplace in the, quote, arts Hollywood scene. You might say, in a way, to keep the demons away in the short to mid-term level or span of time, but it catches up with you. The demons being your fears, your anger, driven in turn by misconceptions, I believe. Now, I like what I've seen in a couple books that may show what a great people person is. Again, Napoleon Hill talking in his book, How to Own Your Own Mind, kind of a discussion between himself and Andrew Carnegie, who had funded him for many years. They're saying in this book that if one comes to the point where one relates very well with people, that's like maybe 90%, or it's the key thing to business success. Well, I think it's the same in Hollywood too, or any other, quote, people job. And business typically is in part business. It's in part people, if not mostly, perhaps. Napoleon Hill had put it this way, that one's relations would be harmonious and things would just kind of flow easily. I might pull up the phrase, you scratch, or I scratch your back emotionally and you'll scratch my back emotionally, and much more, perhaps. You'll do all kinds of favors and so on. Secondly, I love the phrase in the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, who was much more than a person just about public speaking I've seen. For instance, he spent like 3 years writing a book on Abe Lincoln, doing much research beforehand to see what made Abe Lincoln tick. And what was the upshot? It might have been even earlier in the book, around page 30, that if you treat people superlatively, and I would say also, having read just yesterday in the book, The Four Agreements, if you use just the right words, and my own words too, to add the most respectful words, then Dale Carnegie says people will be putty in your hand. Or I suppose, namely, to begin with, they won't be your arch enemies. My experience being they may not like your competitiveness as to taking up market share, or they may not like your input or views on how they got their money sometimes, but they may like very much your respect level, at least from a distance, and accord you a lot of space at a minimum, and in many, many circles do you a lot of favors or cut you a lot of slack. Hence, even in the ministerial field, for instance, a minister who does something rather questionable, shall we say, but is sincerely contrite afterwards, better than average in the people department, shall we say, will find their flock very forgiving oftentimes. The same even if you're a store clerk and you're slow punching numbers in the cash register or scanning things. A great sincere smile and empathy level, being an uplifting cash register operator, will garner a person a lot of slack, so to speak, in their otherwise slowness department. Hence, if you can't smile while you are a clerk in a fast food job, you're going to get weeded out of that position. Sales are going to suffer for the company, and you will be relegated to the back room chopping vegetables, because the vegetables don't care how you treat them. This, then, I believe, is behind those stories you hear of in New York City, say, Manhattan. There being lines very long in front of a disco or nightclub on a Saturday night. But to the person who knows the bouncer, because they're good friends, and in turn because they did something special, namely emotionally, for that bouncer at one time, all they need do is appear on the scene and the bouncer waves them right in without the cover charge, too, through the back door, so to speak. There's also, for instance, a famous photographer, if she's still alive in her 90s, I believe now, from Europe. She reached such acumen at the White House when in America that in 5 minutes she could be in the White House through the back door also. In other words, access to great channels of power or great clubs or what have you because of great relations with the individuals involved. I would close by giving a couple examples in Hollywood of those who make it to top box office draw, if you wanted to call it earning-wise, but also popularity in many channels. Morgan Freeman, for instance, billed by one person, was at number 3 box office stature, financially speaking, about 3-4 years ago. A most humble man, some would say. Clint Eastwood also recently passed on, so to speak, deemed by many a very humble man. Although, curiously, a very flamboyant person in a way in the Westerns, yet quite respectful, you might say. I love the phrase, a person has to know his limits. Was that Dirty Callahan? Of course, said with a rather mean look on the face. I love also the movie Pale Rider. Yet another example, Harrison Ford. And the Actors Guild interview with him once, he was said to be a most respectful person. Interestingly, he said also he learned a lot about people, life, and acting through about, 10 years time spent in hiatus in his career as an actor by doing carpentry to the stars. Very fascinating. He learned how to figure out what makes wood tick, buildings tick, and in turn applied that to figuring out what makes people tick, is my interpretation. Just like, once again, the Thornbirds movie or miniseries in which the senior bishop, or was it cardinal, tried to figure out what Ralph de Burgasar was all about. What makes you tick, Ralph? Was the phrase over and over by Christopher Plummer, the actor. So the more we understand a car, the better it's going to operate in the long term, to include all the oil changes you should be making and how to properly drive it to the best you can. Same with people. The better we understand them, they're given basically no operating manual. For people, though, we have to figure it out ourselves. Or I love thus the analyst in the movie No Reservations saying to an individual seeing him the best recipes are the ones you make up yourself, and the best therapist is the one between your own two ears. I suppose because things can be rather lacking as to what you will get from these channels alone. And these channels, in turn, what you're going to hear that can be disseminated easily on the record, not off the record. Another kingpin point to why the School of Hard Knocks can provide so much information otherwise not garnerable easily. Isn't that then, too, why sometimes you have family dynasties? Because certain off-the-record information can be passed from father to son or daughter, and otherwise isn't easily obtainable by purchase, because what is purchased is on-the-record information. One last individual, Robert Redford. Take, for instance, his movie, was it entitled The Old Man and the Gun, where he is robbing bank after bank, and yet with a smile, and the phrase always being, he was such a gentleman. And in another movie he was in, with Morgan Freeman, interestingly, was it The Unfinished Life, where they are on a ranch out west, and Robert Redford says to a daughter, or was it a granddaughter, I expect you to treat everyone who comes to my home with respect. Now, of course, that's the movies, but at any rate, I think not your average dude can even get a script like that would even have the words in it. And be able to say it, too, in the manner that it is said. And so my conjecture, then, is a person of high respect is a person who understands people the most, and in turn who has the vocabulary to frame what one observes the best, in terms of the best conception of things respectfully, even if it isn't spoken what one sees. So one's words drive one's level of seeing things respectfully and maybe communicating them later too, at the opportune times. How not to stick your foot in your mouth thus with your words. And then all of this driving harmonious relations, as has been described, that term by a few kingpin people. And everything coming along then like the world put at your feet, or people like putty in your hand. Of course, that's not always true. Even Gandhi, for instance, regarded as being gifted in this way, did catch a bullet in the end. But in the long sphere and overall sense, I think he had a great deal of respect for others. And it showed humor and a good smile. And by good, I mean a not manipulative smile. So to recap, ultimately, I think it's good we chase our dreams because they show us our limits and the limits on life. And we discover our good points too. Some of them which we didn't know beforehand and may be uncommon and very useful down the line. But this whole thing can be quite painful. And second, this has elucidated then, I hope, why many a person may find themselves unable to make it in Hollywood, so to speak, in the maximal sense. But that doesn't mean they didn't make it in the smaller sense of learning key things. I'll close with saying I had my own Hollywood experience, and that after the military, a year later, I went to San Diego for 3-4 years and tried to make it in a small company designing things. And that job soon fell through, and I found myself in clerical work for 3 years, upon which I used the excellent medical benefits to engage in psychoanalysis. But it was difficult. no support really, finances on the rocks, living in the ghettos, and cockroaches the size of VW buses that you could simply hop on the back of and ride to work. All at high rent costs nonetheless, and the freeways packed tighter than you can believe. Now that was a hard knock experience amongst others that I had, but if I hadn't gone after that dream, so to speak, when some people told me I was foolish and why don't I just stick home back in my state of Kentucky, I would not have learned so much. The same for those who play it safe in general and comfortable. There might have been those who would have said, don't go in the military, but I learned so much through that school of hard knocks too, even though I only went in to become a medical doctor because they were going to pay my medical expenses if my grades were high enough. Turned out my grades weren't high enough, and I ended up in a combat arms situation in Germany for a couple of years, and it was all very tough, distressing, and more. But the school of hard knocks taught me things thus I wouldn't have learned otherwise. And it was, in both circumstances, a chasing of dreams in a sense, as well as a certain urging on by some others. If you stay then in the little cow town of your life, what will you learn? Isolated in a bubble, you may be safer until in older age, maybe, when you run across some individuals from high school or who knows what, and you see they did make it in Hollywoods of their own making, and you say, oh my gosh, I would have wished I would have taken that risk and gone for that dream. That was probably not going to work out in many cases because I was or inaccurately estimating just who I was and what it takes to make it in the long term even, as opposed to, you might say, sleeping your way to the top, jokingly in that movie with Michael J. Fox. Fascinating ideas. That's my take then on Hollywood. I might add, interestingly, I learned from an aunt who worked in Hollywood and lived in Beverly Hills for decades. She worked for someone very, very well known as a personal assistant for years. She was instrumental in telling me I needed therapy after the military. In fact, upon graduation day from West Point, she saw I had certain strengths but not others. And a year later, I followed her advice. Not that that was the end-all or the most easy solution in life, but it was a key component to saying that life is not all others' problem and that I have a role to play too. That came from someone in Hollywood who also went to Hollywood trying to make it, but never went beyond the assistant level. But she in turn passed along her wisdom, at least in that regard, to me. Who knows what silver linings come from pain, suffering? Boy, did David Goggins talk of that. In his book and videos, his book being You Can't Hurt Me. Fascinating man, pluses and minuses. My thoughts here once again on Hollywood, or moreover, not playing it safe and going for it, even though many people tell you it's going to flop. Well, it's going to flop perhaps, likely, in certain departments, but it won't for everybody. But it will shine for everybody, I think, in terms of what one will learn from the school of dreams that crash. For every failure, as we define it, gives a lesson. Surely. That can't be bought otherwise, because, in my book, the kingpin lessons of life that separate the men from the boys must be acquired from sources off the record, whether it's a grandmother, a parent, or a school of hard knocks, even a dream one chases that is knocked down as to what one hoped it would turn out to be exactly